And it is all up to you. You guys need to make sure that you turn your screen share on, please.
Can you see it?
Yep.
Cool. Everybody can see just the slideshow now, right, Terry?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so I'm excited to chat with you all tonight about insect anatomy and physiology. We're going to cover a lot of ground. If I'm being really honest, I've kind of boiled down about 8 weeks of entomology education into an hour-long lecture for you. So we're going to cover a lot of stuff. There's going to be a lot of new terms for you, hopefully some old terms. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them at the end, or you can get a hold of me after the talk. You can tweet me or email me or what have you. I'd be happy to go over any of it with you. But the reason that we're talking about anatomy, how the insects are built, and physiology, how the insects use their different body parts, are that these kinds of things help us to answer a really important question about what is an insect. And this can be sort of a philosophical question that people may answer with like a lot of adjectives, where they would say, I don't like bugs, so an insect to me is gross, or it's destructive, it's evil, it's a pest, I want to kill it, that kind of attitude. Some people may just find them strange, and then there's weirdos like Natalia and I who think that they're very beautiful and fascinating and worthwhile of study. But what I'm really hoping to do is get at more of a basic answer to this question about where insects fit into the larger animal kingdom, and then you'll understand how they're related to other animals and understand how their bodies work, how their bodies are put together, and how we can use that knowledge to identify what insect you're looking at, and also understand how to look at symptoms from these insects so you can know if something is a pest, what kind of pest, or if it's a beneficial insect and something that we need to conserve and enhance, which will be something that Natalia teaches you a lot about tonight with pollinators. And so that's kind of where we're headed with this particular topic on anatomy and physiology. If we start at the beginning, insects are part of a group known as Arthropoda, which is a phylum of animals that we more commonly refer to as arthropods. Insects are just one of the representative classes within this larger phylum known as Arthropoda. When we look here, you see a honeybee, and that's one representative of insects, but some of the other classes are represented by things like a millipede, or we have a mite. We've got a crab down here in the other corner. And these are the other kinds of classes that exist in Arthropoda. So insects are just one piece of this puzzle. They're the biggest piece. If this was a pie chart, that's the piece of pie that you would want. But the others are important as well, and we need to know what to look for to identify them. In Arthropoda, it may be something that you don't think about very often, but it's very omnipresent in your life. Arthropods are the most biodiverse group of animals on the planet. About 60% of total life on Earth is in this one phylum. And if you look just at animals, about 80% of animals are an arthropod of some sort. So they're a part of every ecosystem. They do all kinds of different things in our environment, and we need to understand them a little bit better and where they come from. So when I'm talking about phylums, when we're talking about phylums, I know that's not normally something that people discuss, phylums in classes and everything. So I would like to just point out what we're talking about in terms of this hierarchy of biological classification. When we're talking about a phylum, it's sort of the third least specific way that you can refer to an animal. And the most zoomed out that you can get is domain. So if you were imagining a camera and you were trying to take a picture of a mountain range, domain is as far away from the mountain range as you can get with your zoom. And then if you had a really special camera that could zoom all the way in onto one little pebble on the mountain, that's species down on the other end. And we use this to understand the relationships between different animals, to understand where things came from in the past, and how things may change in the future. So for us, we're in Eukaryota, Animalia, phylum Chordata, and then Mammalia, primates, Hominidae, Homo sapiens. That's us. If we were looking at that bee that I was mentioning earlier as a representative insect, it's still in domain Eukaryota and kingdom Animalia. So insects are animals. I know some people don't think of them as such, but they are a part of this group. And then they're part of phylum Arthropoda, and then class Insecta. Hymenoptera is their order, all the way down to Apis mellifera, which is their genus and species. So this is just a way of us being able to understand how insects are related to one another. I know that's a quick overview of sort of a complicated subject, so maybe we can talk about it more at the end, but this is sort of how we try to keep things on track in animals. We're focused here on this phylum up front, this Arthropoda group. It's an ancient group. It's one that we believe descended from some marine worms, like you see in this painting here, that lived during the Cambrian era, which was about 500 million years ago. And these animals look sort of like the worms that you know today. They're segmented, but they're also kind of weird that they've got these appendages all over their body. They do have a mouth and an anus like the worms of today, but they lived down in the ocean. And these were some of the early animals that we have in the fossil record. Then these were the things that we believe started to adapt and change into the arthropods as we know them. And this probably started happening about 450 million years or so ago. And if you look at something called the Burgess Shale, which is a fossil bed in northern North America, you'll see arthropods beginning to appear in that fossil bed. And we see things like trilobites, which is the image on the top there. You've got this Tully's monster, if I remember its name correctly, down on the bottom. Just a lot of diversity, this sort of explosion of life. We started to see all these arthropods appear. So these worms started to change. They had more segments. They started growing harder skins, and they became the early arthropods about 450 million years ago. And then there was further pressure for those animals to start changing and become things that we start to recognize more. So once upon a time, something like this existed in the ocean. I call her Enid. She's the ancestor to arthropods. She's segmented. She has a mouth and an anus, but she doesn't have a lot of appendages. And something changed, some pressure or some niche opened up for her to manipulate, and she started to grow articulated appendages and evolve those over time. And this allowed her to succeed at different things. And so there's some fossil out there that we need to find that helps exhibit this, but there is a living creature that sort of exhibits these traits. It's called a velvet worm, or it's part of a group known as Onychophora. This animal has articulated appendages, like I was just mentioning, and it's also got mouth parts, like a lot of the arthropods that we know today. So it could be an early ancestor that still exists today, or it could be a part of a sister group of organisms. But this is something that's out there that we still need to find to understand this history a little bit better. As these animals begin to adapt and change more, they begin to operate in different areas. So they were in the ocean, and we start to see arthropods move on to land maybe 425 million years ago. And this is the first known land animal that you're looking upon right now. Its name is Pneumodesmus pneumoni. And I think it looks a lot like a Tootsie Roll here in its fossil form. It's not very impressive, but this is, according to the fossil record, the first animal to really move around on land. And this is what it looks like according to an artist's model representation. It looks sort of like a millipede that we may see walking around nowadays. So these were the first land animals that we have in the fossil record. There's probably some before it that we just haven't found yet. But you can see they're beginning to look a lot more like what we can recognize as an arthropod, as something we may encounter even today. So there's segmentation and legs and antenna and all kinds of neat stuff on them. And this was a very important thing that happened in the fossil record. It's important not only because it's the first known land animal, but because they got to exploit land before things like us with backbones. They got a head start, and they got to have this explosion of diversity like you see here. So this is from a paper that came out about 3 or 4 years ago that was focused on arthropod phylogenetics and arthropod evolution. And it's very confusing despite being color-coded, supposedly, along the side here. It shows you, though, that there's a lot of diversity here. We go from things like a mayfly at the top left corner all the way to a horseshoe crab in the middle right corner over there, the Xiphoshura. So there's a ton of diversity here, and this is a hot topic amongst entomologists, trying to figure out how all these things are related and how all these things are different. And the big thing that we're looking at here is just that there's lots of branches to this arthropod tree, and part of the reason that happened is that they got a head start on us. I can simplify it a little bit for us and show you that Arthropoda really breaks out into two different branches. One is called the mandible-bearing arthropods, and the other is called the chelicera-bearing arthropods. And then you can go further down from that with the chelicera ones to ones that have that are a part of meristomata, ones that are a part of arachnids, and then on the other side with mandibles, we have myriapods, crustaceans, and insects. There's a ton of diversity here. There's a lot of different kinds of animals. It's hard to imagine that a beetle and a horseshoe crab belong together in a big group, but there are some traits that unify all of these animals into this one phylum. And we're going to talk about what those are here up front. So the uniting traits of arthropods, the first is hidden in the name Arthropoda. It's a Greek word that means jointed foot, and it shows you that all arthropods have jointed appendages. We have jointed appendages as well with our fingers and our knee joints and how we can move around our limbs. So these appendages were an important adaptation to help something like the crab that you see here scuttle around on land. It's an internal hydraulic system that the animal can use to locomote throughout the world. Without this internal hydraulic system, you see things like a squid, where if I had a squid and I dropped it on a table in front of you, it wouldn't be able to move around very well. It could squirm and wiggle, but really it's not going to be able to get through the world. It needs that water. So this adaptation helped the arthropods to move out of the water and get up onto land. Another trait that they all share is that all arthropods exhibit bilateral symmetry. And this just means if you draw a line down the middle of them, they're the same on both sides. So this crab has a delicious claw on each side of the line. It has a couple of antennae on each side, the same number of legs, the same number of fins on the tail end. Our burying beetle has the same antenna on each side. It also has the same color patterns on each side of the line. And we have bilateral symmetry as well. If you draw a line down the middle of you, you're the same on both sides. But this is just a trait that they all share as well. If you wanted to talk about things that separate the arthropods from us, you have to talk more about something like their segmented bodies. Arthropods have these distinct body segments. When we looked at that pneumodesmus model earlier, you saw that it looked like a millipede with lots of little sort of ribs, lots of little segments. Over time, those segments can collapse and become conjoined, so they form things like a cephalothorax and an abdomen for the spider that you see on the right there. Or they can form a head and the thorax and abdomen for the insect on the left. And these segments are important because they do different things for the insect, for the arthropod. They have their own brain on the inside of them. They're just a different way of laying out a body plan. We do not have body segmentation. While you have a head and a chest and legs, you do not have ridges that delineate different spots on your body, that differentiate segments. You're just one long meat tube. And so that's a little different than these arthropods in terms of the way their bodies are laid out. So segmented bodies are important. The final thing that arthropods have that help to differentiate them from lots of other animal life is their exoskeleton. The exoskeleton is a waxy layer that goes over the entire body. It's got chitin in it and some fats and other things, but it's this really thick layer. It's their skeleton and their skin all at once. We have an endoskeleton. Our skeleton is under our skin. theirs is this suit of armor that goes all around them. The way that we interact with exoskeletons most commonly is when we find a cicada shell hanging on a tree. So if you find that, that was the nymphal exoskeleton of a cicada that it has to shed and pop out of in order to become an adult, as you're watching here in this short little video. These exoskeletons protect the insect, the arthropod, from damage and attack. It can also help to stop fluid loss. If you're coated in wax, you're not going to sweat. And so if you're leaving water, you're keeping all of your liquids inside of you. This is an adaptation that helped them to exploit land as well. And the final thing that exoskeletons help them with is that they can attach their muscles far better than we can. When we have our muscles, they're usually attached at just a couple of anchor points. So if you were to pop up your arms and show me your biceps, show me how good your workout's been doing, you would flex your bicep and it would pop up in the middle and you could feel that it's attached at your shoulder and at your elbow. But for an arthropod, their muscles are attached all over because they're covered in skeleton. And so this gives them basically super strength. Like an ant can lift 300 times its own weight over its head. Certain beetles can pull 1,300 times their own weight. It's just a very interesting system for their muscles, and it helps to make them very strong. These are the things that make all of these different classes arthropods, though. So no matter how different they look, they all have these traits that we just discussed. So arthropods, as I mentioned before, can be broken down first by their mouth parts. So they either have mandibles or they have chelicera, and this creates a subphylum. And we're going to talk about the chelicera first. And a chelicera, it's something that's hard to comprehend, I think, for us because we have a normal jaw and mouth type scenario. When we talked about the segments of the body, all of the segments of an arthropod's body used to have legs. But on some of them, those legs began to form different kinds of organs. And in some cases, they became things like fangs, or they became scissor-like organs that were next to the mouth. So instead of having opposing mandibles that sort of chew up their food, they have what amounts to a pair of feet that turned into scissors and chop their food up and shove it into a mouth hole that's behind where the chelicera are. And it's a really interesting way of feeding. The famous example of chelicera are the fangs that you see on a spider. So they don't chop things up, but they use the fang to inject venom and dissolve parts of what they want to eat. And they kind of take the fangs and they crunch up what they want to eat, and they slurp up all the juices as they do that. And so it creates this sort of crunched up ball that used to be a moth or a grasshopper, and it can make a hollow body as well. But it's just an interesting way for them to eat their food. And there are two main kinds of chelicera-bearing arthropods. The first group that we'll talk about is the older of the two. It's called merostomata, and this translated means thigh mouth. So we're just talking about how some of their legs turned into these chelicera, and that's what merostomata is referring to, the fact that part of their mouth used to be legs. The representatives of this group are the extinct sea scorpions and the extant horseshoe crabs. So sea scorpions, you can see one in the painting on the left there. These are animals that would probably horrify most human beings. This is an 8-foot-long arthropod that lived on the bottom of the ocean. So imagine you were down in Florida and you were just like walking around off the coast in the ocean. You could step on this and it has these huge chelicera on the front of it that it could pinch you with. Luckily, these all died out a long time ago and we don't have to deal with that. But we do still have the horseshoe crabs, which you see one on the right. If I was there in the room with you, I'd want to know how many of you have pet a horseshoe crab before. It's a pretty interesting experience to touch what amounts to a living fossil. But all of these merostomates have book gills that they breathe through. They have 6 pairs of appendages on the underside of their head, and they have a pair of compound eyes. You can see the big eyes on the front of the sea scorpion here, and then you can see the tiny ones on the horseshoe crab. They're on the sides there. So this horseshoe crab, this is the only one of this group that still exists. I think there's only about 10 or 20 species of horseshoe crab left in the world. But when you look at these images, one is it crawling up out of the ocean, and on the other one, you can see its legs, and in the front there, you can see its chelicera. They're the scissory-looking organs at the forefront of the head here, and behind it, behind those hairs, those bristles, that's the mouth that it puts the food down into. These have been around for about 450 million years. They have weird blood and a weird life cycle. They are important to us because they help us to create vaccines. Some of the stuff that's in their blood helps us to stabilize vaccines. It's an ancient organism, but it's one that's really fascinating. There's cool YouTube videos that you can watch about them, or books that you can read about them. I find them very interesting. So look some of the facts up about horseshoe crabs and try to pet one in the future if you get the opportunity. The other kind of chelicera-bearing arthropods are the arachnids, part of the group Arachnida, which translates to spider. It's kind of an unfortunate name because Arachnida does not include only spiders, but also includes scorpions, ticks, mites, and the spiders themselves. So it's a pretty diverse group of predators, of blood-feeding parasites, of plant-feeding mites. This has a lot of diversity in it, but they're all under Arachnida. The things that unite the arachnids are that they all have two body segments, a cephalothorax and an abdomen, and then they have no antenna on them, and they have 4 pairs of legs. When you look at something like a scorpion, like the one here on the right, you see those claws. Those are not legs, those are part of their mouth. And so they have 4 pairs of legs, 8 total legs, even when it looks like they have 10, like you see on the scorpions. Other than that, all other arthropods have mandibles. They have jaws that help to either crush food, or they've been modified in a variety of ways to help them to eat their food, suck it up liquid form or siphon it up in liquid form. And there are a ton of different creatures that have these mandibles. The first that we'll talk about are the myriapods. This means many legs, and it includes the centipedes and their cousins, the millipedes. Centipedes are one category. They have 1 pair of antennae, 1 pair of legs per body segment. They tend to be flat in shape, and they have venomous jaws at the front on their head, and they're predators. Their cousins, the millipedes, have 1 pair of antennae. They have 2 pairs of legs per body segment rather than the 1 that the centipede has. They're round in shape, usually darker in color, and they're decomposers. So they eat old leaf material. They don't bite us. They're not hazardous to us or anything. So this is a big group too, but those are the ways that we break them down into the centipedes and millipedes. Then we have the crustaceans, otherwise known as the hard-shelled ones or the delicious arthropods. Things like crayfish and lobsters and shrimp all fall into this category. They have 2 body segments like the arachnids. They have 2 pairs of antennae, though, on their head. They can have 5 to 7 pairs of legs, and then they have swimmerets or gills at the rear end of their abdomen. These are typically in the ocean, so they're usually a marine species. Some of them, like crayfish, can live in fresh water, but there are land-based crustaceans, and I guarantee that you've all met one of them before. It's called usually a roly-poly, or a sow bug, or a pill bug. This is essentially a land shrimp. It has all the traits of a crustacean, except it lives on land. So it's not a tiny millipede or some kind of insect. It's actually a crustacean. They do have a marine relative called a giant isopod that looks like this when people hold it. It's kind of a big version of the roly-poly. They have big glowing eyes on the front of their head and kind of big claws. So that's one in a human hand. This is one sitting next to a kitten on a Japanese game show, just to give you a sense of the size of these organisms. So again, a big group, lots of diversity, but they all have these common traits that we lined out here down on the bottom of the slide. And that leads us to the insects, or insecta, which translates into cut into sections. So this includes all of our insect friends. from roaches to beetles to cicadas to wasps. They all live in this category. They all have 3 body segments, 1 pair of antennae, and 3 pairs of legs. It's a very diverse group. If we look at these photographs on the next slide from Alex Wild, a famous insect photographer, you can see all different kinds of body plans, all different kinds of shapes, sizes, and colors, different roles in the environment, pollinators, predators, plant-feeding insects, decomposers. They do a ton of stuff in the environment. And insects, they're just really important and really fascinating. I know I'm biased as an entomologist, but really we have to start appreciating them more because they are the most biodiverse group on Earth. We have more than 1 million species that we have identified thus far, with the possibility of upwards to 30 million more to find. That's a ton of diversity. If you look at this old pie chart, insects make up about 51% of life on Earth. They truly rule the planet. If aliens landed here and they asked who is in charge, you can't point to people, you have to point to the bugs. If you include the other arthropods, it gets a little bit bigger. But really the point of this chart is to say that bugs rule and plants drool, and we will always win as Team Bug. We will always win. So there's just a ton of them out there, and they play a really important role in our environments. What I want to discuss now is how to build a bug, how to put their bodies together, and how understanding this will help to remove some of the mystery that surrounds insects. If you understand this anatomy, you will understand identification a little bit better, and you'll also be able to formulate better pest management strategies. 1, because you'll know what you're dealing with, and 2, because you'll be able to understand how they create the damage that they create. So it's just a way of knowing your enemy if it's a pest, or knowing your friend if it's a beneficial organism. So we'll start by talking about these 3 distinct body sections: the head, thorax, and abdomen of an insect. Each of these plays a really important role in how the insect is going to succeed. Each piece of the body has a different job, and they have different organs attached to them that help them to succeed at these jobs. If we start at the front of the body with the head, we're talking about the center for sensory information. It's where a lot of the sense organs are. When you look at your head, you have your eyes, you have your nose, your mouth, your ears. Insects have their eyes, their antenna, their mouth parts all on their head. And because all of these sensory organs are there, they also have their largest ganglion in their head. It's the brain. And this is the first of about 6 to 7 brains that's going to be in the insect's body. But it's big because it has to process what the insect sees and what it touches with its different organs. So when you look at the outside of the head, you're going to see a few different things that they use to be successful. The first might be some of the eyes. So they have 2 kinds of eyes on their body. The simple ones are called ocelli, or simple eyes. These are tiny dots that usually are on the very top of the head, and they usually form a triangle shape like you see in this scanning electron microscope image. They're called simple eyes because they don't do very much. They're not very complex. They only perceive light and dark. So for this bee that you see in this image, she may poke her head out of the hole in the ground that she lives in, and if it's dark outside, she'll say, "Dark, go back to sleep." Or if it's light outside, she may say, "Light time, let's go find food." It's all it's there for. It's a very simple structure. The other eyes that you'll see on their head are the complex ones, and we call these the compound eyes. There's a pair of compound eyes on the head, but when you look at them, each compound eye is made up of hundreds or maybe even thousands of lenses. The way that I think about this is to think about if you have a phone that has a camera on it, on the back of your phone, imagine instead of the one lens to take a picture, there was 1,000 lenses. And every time you hit the button, your phone took 1,000 distinct pictures that were looking at slightly different spots that you had pointed the camera at. That's how an insect eye works. So it creates a composite image. When people think of this vision that insects have, they often reference a kaleidoscope. they think that it has to be all the same image multiple times in the insect's eyes. If you ever watch The Fly from back in the 50s, when the fly flies around, it sees 100 of the same thing over and over again. The real way that they see is more like this middle circle in the slide that you see on the screen. It's 100 individual pictures that they stitch together into a composite image. It's very blurry. It doesn't have a lot of depth perception. They would be nearsighted like I am. If they were our size, they would need big glasses. And it's very different from our vision. It's not very crisp. There's no field of depth to it per se. They do get some cool vision attributes though. If we look at their spectrum of vision, they actually get to see different colors than we do. So humans, we see Roy, G, Viv, right? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And we have red here at Nebraska, go big red, right? Insects, they don't get to see red. They wouldn't be Nebraska fans because they can't see the color red. They are gifted with the ability, though, to see UV light instead. So their world looks quite a bit different than ours. If we look at these flowers in this next slide, you see how we see the world on the left and how an insect sees the same image on the right. So our flower is beautiful and yellow, right, Natalia? What kind of flower is this? A rudbeckia. If it doesn't have 6 legs, I don't really understand it very well. So I have to have horticulturalists tell me what kind of flower it is. But if that's how it looks to us, this on the right is how the insect sees it. The UV light helps them to see black spots, sort of black-purple spots on the flower that we call nectar guides that tell the bees that want to visit this flower, the food is here in the center. Please fly towards here. So their vision is different, but it's not worse than ours. It's just a different way of seeing the world. Because they're kind of nearsighted, they do need something to help them sense around them. And what has helped them for a long time are their antennae. Insects all come with a pair of antennae that are located on their head. So these antennae are there for smelling, they're for touching, sometimes they're even used for hearing. They can detect vibrations, like our eardrum detects vibrations, but they usually project off the side of the head so that the insect can probe around with them and feel their surroundings. They may tell the insect that they're touching something delicious to eat. In the left here, we have some ants that have found a Pringles chip that they're going to chow down on and take back to the nest. So when they touch this Pringles chip, they can detect fats and oils and carbohydrates and things that they want to eat. They can also use the antenna to help orient them towards a food source. So mosquitoes, if I were with you, I'd say, how many of you like mosquitoes? And none of you would raise your hands, and we would all have a good laugh about everybody hates mosquitoes. But when they are looking for you, they use their antenna, the female mosquito does, to smell for you. So if they're downwind of you and you're breathing as you run and take a hike up a mountain, your breath is trailing behind you, and they can detect that CO2, and they know that some large breathing, warm-blooded mammal is in front of them. So they'll orient towards you using those antennae. The antenna also help them to detect pheromones, which are hormones that affect fellow individuals of your same species usually. There's a lot of different kinds of insect pheromones out there. One of the main ones that we hear about are aggregation pheromones. These are the smells that they detect with their antenna that tell an individual insect, hey, a party's happening over here, we're all hanging out on this brush, or we're all hanging out in this house, and we're gonna go to sleep here for the winter. If you've ever dealt with multicolored Asian lady beetles in the home, they produce an aggregation pheromone that tells other individuals to come to your house and spend the winter with them. We have alarm pheromones. Aphids are an exhibit of this. They are, when they're disturbed, they'll produce this smell that makes all the other aphids let go of the plant and fall down to the ground. So it's a way of warning each other about danger. Another famous example of this could be honeybees, which produce a pheromone to say the colony is under attack and we all need to fly out and sting the bear or the beekeeper because they're bothering us. We've also got epidietic pheromones, which tell individual females not to lay their eggs in certain areas. In this case, in the image here, we have a wasp that she's looking to lay her eggs in this blueberry. If another wasp has come along and already laid her eggs there, she leaves behind a smell that tells other females not to bother with that blueberry so that they don't all waste their egg clutches on the same berry. We've also got trail pheromones. Ants and termites use these to detect where others have been. Ants can smell this trail pheromone. That's why you often see them in a line coming into your home under the windowsill, because they're following the smell that the first ant laid down. And then, of course, sexual pheromones that say, I'm a lady, you're a fella, maybe we could put on some Marvin Gaye and go back and make baby cockroaches or what have you. So these pheromones are effective because they travel slowly, they don't fade away very quickly, and they're effective over a long range thanks to the antenna on an insect's head. Each antenna can be divided into 3 parts. You're going to hear the number 3 a lot when we talk about insects. It's kind of their magic number. So there's 3 body segments, there's 3 pieces to each antenna, 3 to lots of things. So the pieces of the antenna that you need to remember for identification purposes are the scape, the pedicel, and the flagellum. The scape is the piece that's closest to the insect's head. The pedicel is the second piece, and then we have the flagellum. The way I remember it is the scape escapes from the head, and then the pedicel is the pedestal that the flagellum sits on. It's a way of helping with identification. When you read certain ID guides, they're going to talk about the length of these different pieces, or how many hairs are attached to them, or what color they are. So knowing which piece is which will be helpful in the future. There are many different kinds of insect antenna. The simplest kind is called filiform. These are antennae in which the segments are all basically the same. It creates a thread-like appearance to the antenna. And they're the most common type. You see it on this ground beetle here in the right image. They're just very simple, normal-looking antenna. Nothing too special to write home about. Other antennae can be quite spectacular and interesting to look at. And 2 representatives of that are the pectinate and the plumose antenna. Pectinate antennae are sort of suggestive of a comb. They're flat on one side and then have these long fingers on the other side. And if you saw this beetle, you could snap off one of his antennae and you could use it to comb your eyebrow or your mustache because of that comb-like structure. Then on the other end of this spectrum, we have the plumose antenna, which are feather-like. They have fingers on each side that create this sort of long peacock feather look. And these are important for insects that need to pick up lots of information from their environment. We see these on males very often, and we see these on insects that can fly really well because they use these antennae to smell for females that may be far away. So for this beetle, he's emerged from one tree, and his potential mate could be in a tree that's a half an acre or more away. And he needs to be able to detect her with these big antennae. Same for the Luna moth on the right. So lots of surface area for them to pick up more chemical information. There's also serrate and lamellate. Serrate antennae are common on beetles for the most part, and this is a saw-like antenna. So instead of looking like a comb, it looks like the teeth of a saw blade on those projections on one side. And then also in beetles, we have what we call lamellate antennae, which are sort of filiform at first, and then at the tip, they have this fan-like or book-like structure, these fingers that can open and close and help them to detect lots of chemical information again. We see these quite often on scarab beetles, for example. Some scarab beetles like chafers or Japanese beetles, which I'm sure is a popular insect to many of you. This is another way of them detecting each other in a greater area. So it's sort of like pectinate and plumose, but they're just structured a little bit differently. So serrate and lamellate, that leads us into some of the smaller antennae, which are aerostate and cetaceous. Aerostate antennae only exist, as far as we know, on flies. And on flies, what we see is this big balloon-like structure that you see coming off the front of her face. And then on top of it is the flagellum, and it looks like a plumose antenna that's been glued to this sort of yellowy orange balloon. So if you see this kind of antenna on a creature, it's a fly, and that's helpful for identification's sake. On fast-flying insects, you may see a setaceous antenna. This is just a scape, a pedicel, and then one hair that comes off of the tip there. And these are on fast-flying insects, so cicadas, giant water bugs, dragonflies. It looks sort of like a pencil mustache, like Walt Disney used to have. And this is helpful in lessening drag. If you want to be a fast-flying insect and get around the world quick, you can't have big, long antennae that are going to slow you down. So you have these tiny ones instead. They're just very, very simple in terms of how they work. And then we have geniculate antenna, also known as elbowed antenna. I call them the field goal antenna. They look like they're saying the field goal is good for the Huskers, and we see these on ants. This is only found really in that group. The final kind that I want to mention are called the capitate and the clavate antenna. Capitate and clavate antenna are found mostly on beetles, moths, and butterflies. With capitate, what we see is a long, thin area that at the top sort of explodes into this large bulb. It looks kind of like a light bulb. It's thin and stem-like on the bottom, but then rounded and globular on the top. With clavate antenna, it looks more like an earthworm. It's thin and it gradually gets fatter towards the tip of it. And these antennae, again, are found mostly on moths and butterflies and sometimes on beetles. With that, I want to tell you a little bit about some of the mouth parts that you can see on insects. They come in lots of shapes and sizes, and they perform different roles for the insects. So we're going to go through A, B, C, D, and E here this evening. A is called a chewing mouth part. It's the most common on the insects. It appears in herbivores and in predators, and it's just two simple mashing teeth called mandibles that crunch food up, and then other parts of the mouth help to shove that food into their mouth with the palps and all these other things that you see as part of the mouth. These can create symptomatic types of damage. Chewing mouth parts can be used to create skeletonization. It can be used to create total defoliation like you see in the upper right-hand corner. Sometimes they make shot hole damage like you see in the lower left-hand corner. And their feeding can create bronzing for evergreen plants like you see in the lower right. So these mouth parts, when they feed on a plant, they're chewing off different portions of it, and it leaves behind these different kinds of symptoms. And if you know that they're chewing mouth parts, you know that you're looking at an insect that creates this kind of damage and has those mouth parts. So it's going to help you with identification in the future. There's also piercing sucking mouth parts or needle-like mouth parts. These are the second most common, and they can be used on plants like an aphid or a cicada, or on animals like on the bed bug that you see on the right there. These are used to poke into an object and then to siphon out fluids for food, just like a needle that you would use at a doctor's office. These create distinctive damage as well. On a plant, they create wilting and leaf curling. So if you see leaves that are slowly curling over and there's no herbicides that have been used, the plant is properly watered, this might be an indicator that aphids or whiteflies or scale insects are feeding on that plant. And as they do that, they draw the sap out and the leaves curl up, and it gives them a place to hide. On our skin, when an insect has a piercing sucking mouth part, it usually creates a characteristic red welt on our skin. So mosquitoes and bed bugs, this is what you're going to see on your arm. Then we have sponging mouth parts. Sponges are used to clean up liquids typically in the human world. In the insect world, flies have sponge mouth parts that help them to suck up liquids that they eat. And so when they land on our food, what they have to do, if it's a piece of bread, they may regurgitate some acid. that dissolves part of the bread, and then they lap it up with that sponging mouth part. So that's why we don't like flies to land on our food, because when they do, they immediately vomit on it so that they can eat some of it. It's not very polite of them, I don't think. Then we have siphoning mouth parts. This is a long straw-like proboscis that sucks up liquid. It's kind of like a crazy straw that you could put in some milk if you were a kid. Chewing, lapping mouth parts. These are found mostly with the wasps and the bees. They're used to eat solids and liquids, so pollen and nectar for these pollinating insects. And they have chewing mandibles, but then they have a long tongue that comes out to suck up liquids with. And those are the mouths, and that's the head. It's got a lot of things it has to do. It's why it's got that big brain in it that we mentioned before. With the thorax, we're talking about the body part that is in charge of locomotion. So the insect's legs are always attached to the thorax, and their wings, if they have them, are also attached there. So all of the legs and the wings, they are on this part. If you see a drawing of an insect and it's got legs on the abdomen, that's incorrect. They're all attached to this middle piece. So let's talk about wings first. Insects are the only invertebrates to have evolved wings. That's lucky for us, right? That means we don't have flying spiders or flying crabs coming and hitting us in the face ever. But these wings are important for them in terms of moving around great distances or hunting. They're usually membranous, so they're kind of see-through and kind of delicate. They're filled with veins that help to move their version of blood into the wings. And if you see an insect that can't fold its wings up like a dragonfly, that's a more primitive insect. It evolved a long time ago. Wing folding, like you see on the carpenter ant on the right, is far more advanced. That's an important trait that they have that helps them to be able to crawl in small holes. A dragonfly, it can't hide very easily because it would tear its wings off if it tried to get into a cramped spot. Not all insects have wings. Some of them have never adapted to have wings, like silverfish and firebrats. Others may have wing pads, like a bed bug, that never develop fully into wings. They just have these little nubbins on their back instead. And so there are wings, but sometimes you may not see wings. It doesn't mean they're not an insect. It just means it's not part of their overall body plan. They all have 3 pairs of jointed legs, so 6 total legs that are attached to different regions of the thorax. The thorax is a cylinder that we can divide really into 9 pieces, but the 3 that you need to remember are the prothorax, the mesothorax, and the metathorax. So pro means first, so it's the one that's closest to the head. Meso means middle, it's in the middle. Meta is the last one, and it is closest to the abdomen. And when the legs are talked about, they would be the pro legs, the meso legs, and the meta legs. And that's, again, important when you're using different identification guides. They may use that nomenclature. When you look at an insect leg, it's very similar to ours in design. Maybe not in function, but in design. We both have a coxa, which is the ball that attaches to a hip joint. So ours goes into our pelvis. Theirs goes into those different spots on the thorax we just discussed. After the coxa is the trochanter, which is a stem-like piece that leads into the femur, and then the tibia, and then the tarsi. Their different piece is the pretarsi, which are the claws at the end of the insect's foot. Think of them like our toenails, basically. When they walk, they use a tripod walking motion. They always have 3 toes on the ground all the time. If I were in front of you, I would act it out for you, and you would all laugh at me for looking very silly. But they like to keep those 3 on the ground so they're stable and secure. There are many different kinds of legs. The most basic of them are called ambulatory or cursorial or walking or running or simple legs. These are found on most of the insects in the world, and they're just used to run. They're just the basic legs that get the insect around. Some of them use them to go quite fast. We have a tiger beetle on the left here, very quick insect. Cockroaches can reach pretty high speeds with theirs as well, and that's a cockroach leg there on the right. Some more evolved legs would be ones like the saltatorial or jumping legs. We see these on grasshoppers and crickets and fleas. These are similar to walking legs, except for the femur is big it's enlarged, and there's more muscles in there that helps them to be able to jump great distances. Others include the clasping legs. Part of these legs have turned into a pincer-like structure, sort of like a carabiner that you might use in mountain climbing. These are most common in the lice. So a head louse, like you see in this image here, part of its legs have turned into these clasping claws that they grasp onto surfaces with. Lice have claws that are different depending on where they live. If it's a bird louse, they live on feathers, so their claws are adapted to hold on to feathers. If you have a head louse on a human, their claws are adapted to hold on to your hair. That's why chickens can't get head lice and we can't get bird lice. These are very adapted claws that only work on their primary host. Now you're all itching because we've been talking about lice, I'm hoping. Then we have natatorial legs. These are also known as swimming legs. The legs, part of them are flattened out into a paddle-like organ, and typically they're quite hairy, and this is just surface area to move water out of the way. Diving beetles, giant water bugs, water boatmen, back swimmers like the one on the right here, all of these insects have these natatorial legs. I'm not convinced that Michael Phelps, underneath his human arms, doesn't actually have insect natatorial legs that help him to swim as good as he used to. But these help them to just swim through the water and function better in their aquatic environment. Some of the final legs I want to mention are fossorial legs, also known as digging legs. This is where tibia and tarsi have been turned into a scraper-like organ that helps to move dirt out of the way, sort of like a bulldozer. We see these on a lot of beetles and also on the mole crickets, which is what you see there on the right. The last leg I want to mention is the raptorial legs. These are also known as grasping legs. We see these on mantispids, on predatory bugs, and on mantids. These are legs that part of them have sort of turned backwards, and they have backward-facing spines on one side, and when they close it, it's like a bear trap. They swing it shut, and they crunch their food into there and move it up towards their mouth so that they can eat. It's just a highly modified predatory leg. And they can hurt. If you get your finger in there in a mantid's legs, those spikes can get into you as well. So you do have to be careful when you handle specimens with raptorial legs. Now we're going to end by talking about the abdomen. This is the business end of the insect. Externally, what you'll see on it are the tympanum, the hearing organs, and the spiracles, which are the breathing organs. Internally, if we were in person with each other, what you would be doing right now is dissecting a grasshopper with me. I thought about mailing you all grasshoppers, but they frown on mailing liquids. So we just have to imagine dissecting these grasshoppers together. But if you cut it open, what you would find on the inside is a lot of pieces that make up the cardiac system, the nervous system, respiration, and digestion. But mostly the abdomen end is focused on sexual reproduction. So what we see on the outside are things like cerci. Cerci are sensing organs. They're basically butt antennae that go on the back of things like silverfish, mayflies, earwigs, and cockroaches. So they can be used to touch things behind them, like for the silverfish. They can be used to produce pheromones or to sense pheromones, like on roaches, or they can be used for defensive purposes, like with the earwigs. You may also see at the tip of the abdomen an ovipositor. If the insect is a female, she may have this long sword-like structure that she uses to slice holes to lay her eggs or to dig a hole to lay her eggs, like this katydid that you see on the screen. In other insects, this has been modified into a defensive organ. If you look at the bees, the female queen has an ovipositor that lays eggs, but all of the female workers below her, their ovipositor has turned into a stinger for defensive purposes. So instead of eggs, it delivers poison into your body, and that's how the sting hurts you. So you can see that at the tip of the abdomen. Close to the thorax, you may see a tympanum. This is an eardrum-like organ. It's this yellow oval that you see on the image on the right. It's a stretchy membrane located over a hollow area, and it vibrates when the air moves around it. And so this is how insects hear. Instead of having their ears on their head. They would have their headphones like I'm wearing closer to their midsection. I'd have it around my stomach instead. You would also see spiracles, small dots along the edge of the insect's body. These are part of a complex series of network tubes that are the tracheal system. So these spiracles are holes where the insect breathes in. We're going to talk about insect blood here in a moment, but their blood doesn't move oxygen around. They have to have tubes that go everywhere, all over the place to deliver their oxygen. So when you look along the edge here, you see these spiracle openings that they can open and close to let air in, or close if they get thrown into some water so that they don't drown as much. So these spiracles are just the external opening for their breathing apparatus. If you were to look inside, you would see that compared to us, their nervous system and circulatory system are reversed. If I had you lay down on the floor with your belly on the floor, and I asked you where your heart was, is it closer to the floor or the ceiling? You would say the floor. Your spine is closer to the ceiling. For insects, that is reversed. Their brains would be along the floor, and their hearts are along the back, closer to the ceiling. Their circulatory system is open. Ours is closed, so our blood stays in our tubes all the time. With an insect, they have multiple hearts that suck up free-floating hemosil and then pump it forward into their aortal tube. At the end, it's just like a garden hose. It spurts out, and then it floods the body, and it moves around food, energy basically, and can also help to carry away wastes. So they do have sort of an immune system, but when you cut an insect open, you're not going to see this gory red mess like you would with a person. It's kind of green or brown. They don't have hemoglobin, so their blood is not red. It doesn't carry oxygen around. It just carries away bacteria or helps to carry nutrients to different systems. They do have more brains than us. They have that main brain in the head. Then they may have 3 thoracic ganglia that help to move their legs, and then abdominal ganglia, anywhere between 3 and 6 of those, that help to move certain organs, to help breathe, to help activate different pieces of their body. So these are just some images of brains and the nerve cord that runs along the bottom. No hard encasement like our spine, just this open nerve cord across the bottom. This multiple brain system helps them to fend off damage. If they lose their first brain, they can't see or feel anymore, but they can still walk around. It's important for things like mantids because in a mantid mating, sometimes she may turn around and eat his head during the mating process. And what we have found through research is that this actually helps the male to mate better. Once you remove his main brain, he actually mates with more abandon, is how the scientists describe it, and he impregnates the female better after doing that. So it's sort of an adaptation to have these multiple brains, to be able to survive losing one, to keep doing the things that you need to do to survive, to walk around, and even to mate in certain situations. We'll finish up by talking about digestion. Insects do have a complete digestive system, which means that there's a mouth and an anus rather than a combined organ like you would see on a jellyfish or a starfish. And so they eat, the food goes through their midgut, their foregut, and the thorax, down into the midgut and the abdomen. There are things called the Malpighian tubules, which serve as kidneys, and then they have a hindgut, which is sort of like their colon. So a lot of these organs are located in the abdomen. Oh, I was incorrect. We do have the reproductive systems to talk about. So they use internal fertilization most of the time. Some insects do leave an egg somewhere and then the male fertilizes it later, or the male may leave sperm packets on stalks and then the female picks them up and uses them. But for the most part, they mate directly, like you see with these beetles and bugs and butterflies here. The internal reproductive system is very similar to ours. There's the ovaries. There's a spermatheca where the female stores extra sperm that she's going to use later on in life. There are accessory glands that help to activate everything. The male has testes where the sperm is stored, and then he has a seminal vesicle that it travels down before he injects it into the female, and she keeps it in her spermatheca. And as the eggs fall down, she inseminates it and then lays the egg. She leaves these in different spots, either in clusters or spread out, depending on the species. And then they go through either complete metamorphosis where they're an egg and then a larva and then a pupa and an adult. They look very different from their childhood stage to their adult stage. Or they can go through incomplete metamorphosis, which is an egg and then nymphs that look very similar to the adult. They just get bigger and grow wings when they become an adult. With that, I hope that you've enjoyed learning about some of the anatomy and physiology. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them. I don't know how to get to the chat box, though.
You have a couple. You can either open the chat box that's at the bottom of your screen if you, or I guess you're on, there should be like a little extra thing that opens it up for you, or I can read them to you.
I demand that you read them to me.
Okay, well. How do lightning bugs glow?
Lightning bugs glow by combining two different chemicals in their abdomen. They have luciferin and luciferase. And in their abdomen, there's a cavity where they inject these two compounds, and then as they mix together, they create that bioluminescent glow that we see in the night. If you expose it to more oxygen, it burns quicker. It doesn't produce any heat. It's actually way more efficient than the light bulbs that we create. When you have a light bulb, about 80% of the energy that goes into a light bulb is wasted as heat. With a lightning bug, almost 100% of the energy that goes into those two compounds is turned into light. So it's a very efficient, very interesting way of creating light.
The next question is, can you regrow antennae?
Once you lose an antenna as an insect, that's usually kaputski for that. There's not a chance as an adult to molt again and regrow antenna. So no, once they lose that, they're going through the world with just one antenna at that point.
And then where would you place Protura, Diplura, and Columbia?
Columbula, Diplura, and Protura are a part of Hexapoda, which is the larger group that insects are a part of. I didn't want to get too far into that, but they are six-legged. There are some differences, though, that make them, if you have Hexapoda as this big group, there are insects, and then there are the proturans and everybody else over here. So they're cousins. They see each other at family events, but they don't hang out very often. They're related, but not super closely related.
That's a very good explanation. And I have many family members like that. So do you guys want to take about a 15-minute break?
Cool.
Okay. We will take a 15-minute break. It is 7:33, so actually I'm going to give you a 13-minute break and say 12 minutes, so come back at 7:45.
Okay.
Well, you might just want to talk about them because not everybody would have seen you
typing
them.
So when somebody asked if insects feel pain, they can feel pain. We have some computers that we can use to actually attach their brain to, and we can measure their response to external stimuli. So we know that they feel cold, they feel heat, they do feel pain as we sort of traditionally understand it. They may not react quite the same way that we do, but they can feel it. Somebody asked, on average, how long do insects live? And insects live just about one growing season. If it's something that overwinters as an adult, they can live for maybe a full calendar year or so. But for the most part, it's the summer, and then at the end of the summer, they perish. There are some insects that are longer lived. If you've seen periodical cicadas in videos before, or if you've visited the eastern portion of the state or other states, you may have seen periodical cicadas before. They live for 17 years. And then we have some termite queens that can live in tropical areas that can live like 20 or 25 years sometimes, a long time. Somebody asked if all the efforts that we do to remove insects that live on plants or in houses are insect populations diminishing. And the truth is no, that for the most part, insects are very resilient. They're able to out-reproduce our control efforts. Their ability to reproduce is quite amazing, and so they can out-reproduce our control methods, particularly the pests. Some beneficial insects are a little slower to overcome exposure to certain insecticides and things like that. We're actually going to talk about that with the bees here in a moment. So sometimes they're harmed, but they're amazing and resilient, so they almost always bounce back, even the good ones that get harmed by the insecticides. I think I hit them all.
Okay, great. So you want to share your screen and move to your next?
Let's do
I'm
it.
going to assume Natalia.
That would be an incorrect assumption.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I did it wrong. I'm a millennial. I'm supposed to be good at this. There we go.
All right. You can see your screen. Now I have it in presentation.
So they see the slides, not the presenter mode?
I see the presenter mode.
Okay. Shazam.
There you go.
All right. Now we're going to transition into talking about some more specific kinds of insects. We're going to talk about insect pollinator conservation. I'm going to talk about everything sort of generally that's happening with pollinators and how to use insecticides around them. Natalia is going to finish up the evening by talking about pollinator insect conservation and some really cool activities that you can partake in that she's in charge of that are just really awesome. It's really fun, and you're going to help pollinators out if you take part in them, right, Natalia?
Yes, that's exactly what I said.
And we've got some stuff to cover before we get to that part, though. So you have to listen to me a little bit longer. If you've heard about pollinators recently, you've probably heard that most people have talked about pollinator decline. We're seeing a reduction in sheer numbers of bees. We've seen a decline in their population totals, and we've lost some biodiversity as well. We're seeing local extinctions of some bees. An example would be the state of Illinois has demonstrated they used to have 25 species of bumblebee. Now they're down to 20. So we're seeing these small local changes in pollinator populations. This has been a startling issue for a lot of people. A lot of folks are really concerned about this, and they want to know what's going on, because we've always been taught about how important pollinators are to agriculture and to food production and just the beauty of the world. So it's caused a lot of people to point fingers in different directions and want to know what's happening. And I always preface this discussion by saying this is an onion issue. It has a lot of layers, and it makes you want to cry. There's just a lot to unpack with pollinator decline, and I'm going to go through some of those different layers here before we get into the discussion of how to help them. So the first thing, and sometimes the toughest thing for us to confront that impacts pollinator populations, is habitat loss due to increased urbanization. We continually remove green spaces like parks or meadows or just even golf courses or places like that and turn them into parking lots and shopping centers and McDonald's and houses. And this reduces food resources for pollinators. It reduces nesting sites for them. It drives them to forage over greater distances, so they get hit by cars or eaten by birds. And it's just very stressful for them to confront our urban sprawl. And this is something that not a lot of people like to think about, because it means changing the way that we interact with the world. So this is one of the tougher ends of the spectrum of pollinator decline to deal with. But Natalia is going to teach you how you can, at your own home, help to combat habitat loss. If we focus specifically on social bees like honeybees and bumblebees, there are diseases that they are impacted by as well. If any of you are a beekeeper, or if you learn about beekeeping in the future, you may hear about a disease called Nosema apis. It's on the right there. This is a dysentery-like disease. It makes the bees defecate all over the outside of their hive. It's pretty gross. And this is a disease that can stress hives out. It's been around for a long time. But there are newer diseases too, like Israeli acute paralysis virus. I bet you can never guess where it came from or what it does to pollinators based on the name. This is a disease that we think is linked to colony collapse disorder. So it impacts honeybees. Colony collapse disorder is a term that gets thrown around a lot. That is a phenomenon that only affects honeybee hives. So it's not pollinator decline. Pollinator decline includes colony collapse disorder, but it's not only about honeybees and colony collapse. But this disease, according to some researchers, may be a part of that disappearing honeybee hive phenomenon. The other part of colony collapse disorder, a lot of folks believe, is linked to parasitic mites that attack honeybee hives. Some of the older mites that we've dealt with were called tracheal mites. These are small arachnids that get inside of the breathing tubes of a honeybee, and they clog her breathing apparatus up, basically give her bronchitis or asthma. She doesn't breathe and respirate as well, and she can become very stressed out by that. We have, for the most part, beaten the tracheal mites. Some research done actually here in the state of Nebraska helped to defeat that pest, but there's a new mite that's in town that causes a lot of issues called the varroa mite. Its scientific name is Varroa destructor, which I think sounds a lot like a supervillain, and it's a mite that is a blood-feeding mite. It gets on the outside of adult bees and larval bees, and it drinks their blood. So they attach themselves. It's like a tick. Imagine you had a tick on you the size of a house cat, and you start to understand what a bee goes through when they get one of these mites on them. So these mites can transmit diseases. They are stressful to the honeybee. It's just not a good thing to have in the colony. So those things combined are stressful. We've seen some human effects on pollinators. Chief among them sometimes are beekeeping practices, which can stress bees out and lead to colony loss. Beekeepers are used to colony loss. Sometimes every winter you lose about 30% of your bees. Depends on the honey stores. Sometimes beekeepers have to take more honey from the hive to fill an order, big commercial beekeeping situations. And that stuff, that honey that the bees are going to eat gets replaced with different objects like high fructose corn syrup or sugar water. And that's not as nutritious for the bees, so it can weaken their immune system, open them up to those diseases we discussed and mites. It's also a stressful scenario when bees are moved around the country. This semi-truck that you see on the right here is a flatbed trailer that's transporting colonies of honeybees from site to site. This is the quickest way to get through a truck weighing station if you're a semi-driver, is to have a truck full of bees in the back. But they truck these around. There are certain routes that the honeybees go on. So a honeybee could begin the growing season in Iowa at an alfalfa farm, and then later in the season be moved to an avocado plantation in California. It could go up to an apple orchard in Washington a month later, and then end up the year in a sunflower farm in North Dakota. So this travel is stressful. They're put in communal situations where they swap diseases and parasites. I have a young daughter, and we just started sending her to daycare, and she's come back with multiple colds and fevers and stuff. It's sort of the same idea. There's lots of things living together in a small area, and they're swapping diseases frequently. So this has led to some colony loss as well. But if you've heard about anything in pollinator decline, I'm guessing it's about insecticides and pollinators, particularly the neonicotinoids. So these are insecticides that we use to control many different kinds of pests. Insecticides are meant to kill insects, so it stands to reason that they can kill pollinating insects like bees. The neonicotinoids are the most widely used class of products in the world. There's 3 examples here on the screen. We've got Arena, Merit, and Safari, or clothianidin, imidacloprid, and dinotefuran, if you're using their chemical names. These products are used in corn, they're used in soybeans, used in turf, used in tree protection, shrub protection, gardens, all over the place. These are a popular product because they work against a lot of insects. They also are relatively safe when you compare them to older chemistries, like 7 or even the pyrethroids in some cases, and especially organophosphates and organochlorines. These products were sort of hailed as revolutionary in the 90s when they came out. More and more data is suggesting that they do have the possibility of impacting pollinating insects, though. And we'll talk more about that here in a moment. The truth of the matter is that we're talking about a perfect storm. This is a bunch of things happening all at once that are combining to harm pollinator populations, to sink the good ship pollinator here in my analogy. So it's difficult to accept because we want to point to one of these things and say, if we get rid of this, if we change this, if we do that, we'll save the pollinators. But the data doesn't bear that out. Historical evidence across the world doesn't bear that out. We need to confront this holistically and address each of these things separately and collectively so that we can help pollinators. Sometimes that's not something that we as general citizens can do. There's not a lot you can do as a non-beekeeper and non-farmer necessarily about diseases and insecticide use on a corn farm. But you can change the way that you use insecticide products. You can help stop habitat loss. You can help join the team that helps pollinating insects. So we have a couple of simple things to talk about around how to do that. The first is to always use insecticides responsibly. So these insecticidal products like you see shown here, these are tools. These are things that you need as part of an integrated approach to collect or to kill plant feeding insects or to help control things that are attacking you on your person. These are a part of that toolbox, and there's no reason to say that they have to go away. There's synthetic ones, there's organic ones, but they are part of an integrated approach. Part of our responsibility, though, is to practice good insecticide stewardship. If you misuse your tools, you're not doing yourself, the environment, or beneficial non-target insects like pollinators any favors. We have to use these things properly. If we don't, we see situations like we saw in Oregon a few years ago. Some folks treated plants against the label in a way that was hazardous to pollinators, and they killed 50,000 pollinating insects. It says on the label how not to do that, and they ignored that advice and performed a service that was dangerous. That is irresponsible. That's not right. If we use these products correctly, we can stop this from happening, and we can control the pests that we don't want around anymore, but we don't have to harm things that we like pollinators. So when we use insecticides, they can be put out in different formulations. Some are granular, some are liquid, some are seed coatings. But as general homeowner type folks, you're probably going to use granular or liquids, maybe a powder every so often, but these are usually the most common. And when you use a granular, it dissolves and is absorbed by the plant. A liquid formulation can be systemically absorbed by the plant, or it can just protect the leaves. The question here is, when you're applying these products, are you contaminating flowers? Either directly, when you spray a liquid, does it get into a flower and poison a pollinator? Or does a plant absorb enough from the soil to systemically transfer insecticide from down here in the root zone up into the leaves, the stem, and then the flowers to harm pollinators? This has always been the big question. I did some research in Kentucky for my PhD that was sort of centered around this. I'm a turfgrass entomologist by training, so we worked in turf with turf weeds, and we treated these with liquid, these areas like you see in the left, with liquid insecticides at label rate. We irrigated them. We did everything like a lawn care service would, except we treated flowers when we weren't supposed to. We put these tents up that you see in the right-hand image, and inside of the tent we put colonies of bumblebees, and we forced them to feed on these treated flowers, and we looked at their overall health to see what impacts we could see. We looked at a neonicotinoid insecticide and a newer kind of insecticide called an anthranilic diamide, and we were making comparisons between these two classes. What we found is when we went and looked in on the bees and counted them up at the end of the season, that exposure to the neonicotinoid had led to greater impacts in the hive when they fed on these treated flowers. About 34% mortality for the neonicotinoid compared to about 6% for the other insecticide in the control. So this is strong evidence that they can harm pollinating insects. But we went through in these tents and we mowed all of the treated flowers out and let new ones grow in. And when those new flowers grew up and new colonies of bees fed on those new flowers, there were no effects. These colonies were healthy. So direct contamination created a scenario where the bees were harmed. Systemic transfer wasn't enough to kill the pollinators. We followed that up and showed even further that levels in weeds and turf, when you mow afterwards, those flowers that pop back up, they have about 8 nanograms per gram of the insecticide in there. So that's at way below lethal levels for these insects, way below sublethal levels. when you directly contaminate it, the levels are really, really high, around 5,500 nanograms per gram. So that's pretty dangerous for a pollinator. This is good data to have for a lawn. There's more data still coming in for other plants that we treat, like ash trees or shrubs that we try to protect, and things could change in those different plants because certain plants transfer insecticides in different ways. But what it looks like in turf is that the mowing helps to remove some of the negative effects. Some other data that we collected showed that neonicotinoids gained weight at a slower rate, and they produced fewer queens overall than the anthranilic diamide insecticide. This is just a demonstration that different insecticide classes have different effects, and that these effects can be lethal, like the mortality that we talked about, or if they're exposed to enough insecticides, it can impact long-term things like queen production. And so the neonicotinoid did impact those things while the newer insecticide didn't. So there are differences amongst classes, and there's different ways of avoiding this issue. To practice good insecticide stewardship, be sure you never treat the blooms of trees, shrubs, weeds, or annual plants. If you get insecticide into the flower, you will kill pollinating insects. So always treat after petal fall, or don't treat the plant at all if it's blooming. If it ever blooms with a synthetic product, try an organic or biorational product like neem oil or BT, or a synthetic product like acelepryn. These products pose less hazard to pollinators. Always check insecticides for what's called the bee diamond. This will tell you if it has a special hazard to pollinating insects and how to avoid creating that situation. So we can use these tools, we just have to use them right. And if we do that, we're not going to poison our pollinating friends. There's some other things you can do, like remember that weeds are flowers too. Natalia, what is the email signature that you have?
Weeds are flowers too once you get to know them.
Weeds are flowers too once you get to know them. So things like dandelion and clover, while we consider them a pest, they actually feed a lot of pollinating insects. I did a test in Kentucky that showed over 50 different species visited just these two lawn weeds. And it included honeybees and bumblebees and flies and mining bees, all different kinds of diversity. So if we can let clover and dandelion live a little more, social bees and butterflies and flies and solitary bees will benefit more. And you can even do this in an urban area. We found that we could compare urban to rural populations of weeds and show that pollinators still exist in an urban area. We think that cities and towns may not have as much biodiversity, but if we look closer at the situation, we find that in a park like this one that you see here, that's surrounded by pavement and concrete, if you look at the population of pollinators there, maybe it's really not that different from its rural counterpart. So we looked at 18 parks in Lexington, Kentucky, and I figured out how much concrete and pavement were around them. And we ended up with 7 urban sites, which is 20% or more of the area covered in pavement and concrete, 4 suburban sites, which are 13 to 16%, and 7 rural sites, less than 10% of the area covered in hardscape. And when we sampled pollinators in these different areas, we found that diversity is just as high in the city as it is in a rural area. So if we now found 9 species of bee in a rural place, we were just as likely to find 9 species of bees in the city. There are differences in what 9 that you find though. And the biggest difference was in bumblebees and honeybees. The more urbanized an area is, the fewer bumblebees we saw. And the more urbanized an area was, the more honeybees we saw. So basically, bumblebees seem to be more of the country folk, the farmer folk, while bumblebees seem to be the more cosmopolitan city slicker types. There could be lots of reasons for this happening. There could be just food resources, all different kinds of things at play here that impact this diversity. But something is happening that changes these dynamics. But it's important to show that even if you live in town or if you live in a big city like Omaha, you can still contribute to pollinator conservation by having weeds, by not using insecticides incorrectly, and by making intentional pollinator plantings, which Natalia will tell you about here this evening. So we're going to switch slides.
ridiculous.
Go for it.
Good? Okay. Hi, everybody. Is that this keyboard or that one? Okay, so like Jonathan said, the biggest way to help, or maybe one of the easiest ways to make a contribution as far as pollinator plantings goes, are in fact planting for pollinators and not just for your own garden landscape gratification. But in an ideal situation, you'll marry the two and come up with a pretty nice landscape. So even though Jonathan has these pictures in his slide, what you really need is this one. Because this is the Nebraska pollinator habitat, as you can read. Excuse me. This is the sign, the outdoor sign that anybody that becomes certified with the Nebraska Pollinator Habitat Program that we started this last year is eligible to have. And we'll talk about that more towards the end. And that was actually the main part of why I joined tonight, was to talk about the pollinator habitat certification program. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about other things that you can do to encourage pollinators and increase habitat. Okay, before I talk too much about that, I want to cover something that gets thrown around a lot, and that is if you need to plant native or non-native plants. And first of all, I am not a purist, and so I will say you plant whatever you like and whatever will grow in your landscape and whatever the bees like, and that's all you need. Thank you. And so I'm by no means one or the other. I think there's room for everything. But if you are talking about native, you have to ask yourself, well, native to what? Native to Dodge County, native to Nebraska, native to the Great Plains, native to the United States. And so really you need to identify that when you're talking about starting any sort of landscape, and if you want to be quote unquote native, what does that mean? What does that mean to you? So if it's if a plant or an insect or a mammal of any type is endemic, that means that it's found in some sort of defined geographic location. And it can be big or small, but in that location, that's where it is endemic to. And on the other opposite end, or the other side of that coin, I guess, would be cosmopolitan, in which whatever species we're talking about has a distribution that is found everywhere or usually worldwide. So this would be one example of something that maybe in the green you can see the plant or the insect is found in these locations. And so while the United States is pretty much covered, and parts of Europe and into China, this species of whatever it is found, the geographic location is obviously very different. However, the latitude in the hemisphere is relatively similar, which is why things like plants native to China will do usually quite well in Nebraska, generally speaking. And so it's not necessarily native strictly to the United States, but it is considered, or would be considered, native if it had a spread like what you see on the screen. If we start to zero in, and maybe said plant or said insect is only found in these states that are shaded green, that would be a much smaller area that the species is endemic to, but it could still be considered native to the United States, just maybe only the eastern side. And it would still be, like, say, for example, if this was like some sort of maple species, a maple tree. The genetics in the north end part of this range would be different than the genetics found on the south end of this range, even though it's still a maple tree of whatever species we're talking about. And so that's why when sometimes you'll see or hear people talk about locally sourced seed, or local source of whatever plant species that you're planting or growing, it usually means that it's been collected and grown wherever it's then going to be planted, because something that's been grown in Tennessee, adapted to living in Tennessee, is going to have a hard time making it up in Maine, even though maybe the range of the species can go up that far. It's going to be a lot different situation. And then if you go even farther down, say there's just one plant that's only been found in these 5-6 counties in Nebraska. So it's still technically native to Nebraska, but I think the people that are listening in the Panhandle will contest that their growing conditions is a lot different than those of us on the east side of the state, and vice versa. And so something might be native to Nebraska, but it might only be native to the very southern eastern side of the state or the far west. And so again, it might not be necessarily the best plant choice for you, even though it is still a Nebraska native. So I really just encourage you to do your research whenever you're trying to add something that is native, Nebraska native, or Great Plains native, anything like that, just to make sure that you do know where it's native to. And to say that it's native to North America is not really enough. And then, of course, when we're talking about cosmopolitan and having a worldwide range, obviously the geographic locations are different, but also the growing conditions in the far northern parts of Canada down to the far south parts of Africa and over on to Australia. It's going to be completely different. That just means that that species is adapted to a very, very wide range of habitats. It could be temperature, it could be precipitation, it could be humidity, it's probably all of these things, but either way, that species can thrive in all situations. Okay, so when we're talking about creating a landscape specifically for pollinators, ideally we would have all of these things, but of course, you know, we don't live in an ideal world, and so we have to make concessions and do what we can. First of all, they need food, and so they need the large groups of flowers that or plants that flower during 3 seasons. And it's really easy to have things that bloom in June, but it's maybe more harder, or you have to make a more concerted effort to have things that are blooming now, April, and then again in the fall, September, October. And that's really when pollinators are either building up in the spring, building up their populations, maintaining more so in the summertime, and then getting ready for winter into the fall. And of course, honeybees would be a perfect example of this, and they have these 3 season peaks of when they're really looking for forage resources. But it would be with all pollinators as well. A lot of the pollinator plants that we suggest for people to plant are sun plants or sun-loving plants, and that would be considered full sun, 6 hours or more a day of sunlight. And it's not so much because of the plants. There are some shade-loving or tolerant plants that are pollinator-friendly. It's more so for the pollinators because they are insects and their bodies don't warm up like ours do, and so they need that full sun to really be active. There are, like I said, those some shade plants, and we won't talk about specific plants tonight, but if you have questions, just email me and I can get you a list. Like all living things, pollinators need water, and that's a huge component, I guess, of having a really good landscape that's friendly to pollinators. And it doesn't have to be running water, just regular bird bath is fine, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Little to no chemical use, and that's not necessarily because pesticides are inherently bad. Like Jonathan already talked about, it's a tool. It shouldn't be the first tool that we go to, and it shouldn't be the only tool that we go to when there's a problem in our landscape. And I would encourage, first of all, everybody to relax. If you have a couple weeds in your yard, it's okay. There's bigger fish to fry, and then a couple dandelions. And so by doing that, you take some stress off of yourself, but then also provide food and floral resources for pollinators that need it, and maybe an otherwise completely turf-dominated landscape. Little or no chemical use is really just to ensure that the food that they're feeding on is not contaminated, and they're bringing back contaminants into either the hive or to their own nest if they're solitary. And so really just the less that you can use, the better. Native bee houses is a nice way to encourage native pollinators to inhabit your landscape and offer them nesting space that they may or may not have. We'll talk about nesting habitat a little bit more in a couple slides. Weeds are, fortunately or unfortunately, a really big part of a really good pollinator habitat. They're some of the best as far as providing the necessary proteins that insects need, pollinators specifically need, nectar as well. But there's just so many that are really good for pollinators that, again, you just need to just relax. It'll be okay. And again, I always prefer a mix of non-native and native plants. That's because not all of our pollinators are native. The first of which are most important would probably be the European honeybee. So by having non-natives as well as native plants, I feel like I'm feeding everybody, and also including plants that I just like to have in my landscape because I find them pretty. Protection from wind, it's not always the case in Nebraska, and it's certainly not always doable, but if you can, that would be ideal. And again, patches of bare soil, and that would be for the ground nesting bees that we'll talk about towards the end. So this would be just a couple examples of how to have water on hand for pollinators. They cannot swim, and so having a big pool of open water is not desirable. And so if you have anything like any of these that you see, rocks, pebbles, marbles, anything like that, it gives the insects something to stand on while they drink. It's important to remember, though, that this is standing water, and so not only will the pollinators utilize it, but so will the mosquitoes. And Jonathan, how long does it take for a mosquito egg to hatch?
Just a few days. I mean, you could have a generation in a couple of weeks.
A couple of weeks.
Right, yeah.
So every 7 days, I suggest
Absolutely
cleaning out your water supply, whatever it is. Dumping it out, hosing it down. If there's any eggs or anything like that, it's on the sides. You'll get that off that way, and then fill it back up. So they should always have fresh water, not necessarily because they can't drink or won't drink stagnant water, but because you want to not increase the population of mosquitoes.
What about bottled water from the spring?
Only French artesian water. So a lot of people want to talk about how pesticides are killing all of the insects. And like Jonathan said, that is definitely a layer. I heard somebody say death by 1,000 cuts.
Oh, I like that one.
I like that one. It's very like
Ninja-y?
Ninja-y, yes. But what I also really like to talk about is habitat loss, because you can be a completely organic acreage, but if you don't have the habitat, it's not going to matter. And so I encourage people to look at this picture and then the next picture that we're going to see after that, in 2 different scenarios where habitat has been lost for pollinators, other mammals, anything like that. So if you were to see this gorgeous cornfield anywhere in Nebraska or the surrounding states, it's going to feed a lot of things and a lot of people and do a lot of good. But if you are a bee and you live on that far side of the screen in those trees and you have to fly across the field to get any food, that's going to wear you out, first of all, and probably indirectly decrease your numbers of offspring. Is that fair? That's fair. However,
Hey, Natalia.
yes.
They didn't hear it was death by what?
1,000 cuts. Did you hear me that time?
Thank you.
Dust cuts. So this is a picture that I like to show for urban scenarios that also have little to no habitat. If you look at this landscape, this is a lovely home and very little, if any, flowering plants. So the turf is completely weed-free. The evergreen shrubs surrounding the house, possibly a maple tree on the right. I don't know what kind of tree that is. I can't tell, and I don't know where this house is. But it's definitely something that is as much a intensification of agriculture problem as it is an intensification of urbanization. And so anything that you do, no matter where you live, it's going to make a difference. That's my point. But no matter what situation that you're coming from, there's problems, but there's always solutions.
So I'm sorry to interrupt again. They did not understand what that term means. Death by 1,000 cuts.
Death by 1,000 cuts. It's just like Jonathan said with the situation with pollinators being like an onion and there's a lot of layers. Not one cut is the lethal item that's killing all the pollinators. They're dying because 1,000 things are happening against them. Does that make sense? I'll assume it does. So what?
That was I don't know if they're typing or not, but I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you. So this is the foraging area. I didn't realize it was blurry until I'm looking at it right now, but this is the foraging area for honeybees. And honeybees travel a lot farther from their hive than some of the other solitary bees. But this is just to give you an idea of how far they can fly. They prefer to stay in that 1 to 2 mile radius right around the hive. But if they don't have the floral resources that they need, they'll go farther. But when you say they can go up to like 4 or 5, 6 miles away from the hive, 4 or 5, 6 doesn't sound like a whole lot, but when you think about that radius around the hive and how many acres that includes, then you're talking about a massive amount of floral space, or if they don't have habitat, it could be apartments, anything like that they're going to come into contact with. But if you look at the radius for just 1 mile, all around that hive, that would be about 2,000 acres. And so it's a fairly large space. And so I just want to caution people against thinking that if they have a hive, a backyard hive of honeybees or anything like that, and have a lot of flowers on their property and think that their honeybees aren't leaving their property, they are, trust me, because there's so many bees in that hive and they have so much mouths to feed that they have to leave. And so they are getting flower resource from other places as well as, where they are foraging right around their hive. There's been a lot of talk about putting in like pollinator strips for agriculture fields. And I think that generally that's good, but something like this, would still provide nesting habitat and floral resources, especially with like plum bushes like this next to like a grassy area and maybe the fields on the other side. The bad thing about this is, or I guess something that you need to consider, is that the flowers and the plants that are in between these fields are still likely to be contaminated by pesticides that are used in the fields. And so I don't know if sometimes they're called a sink, and I don't know if would you say that they are good or bad?
It's a sticky wicket.
It's a complicated scenario. So you're still doing good in providing habitat, nesting habitat, as well as floral resources, pollen and nectar, but they are coming into contact with pesticides. So just keep that in mind whenever you see these mentioned. There's good and bad to everything, right? And it's the same way with the house. If it's, you know, something urban, chemicals are misused by everyone or anyone, and can be decreased by everyone and anyone. And the plant choices around your house, as well as if you have something more formal like a really nice putting green in your backyard, maybe something around your house immediately will be more for the pollinators and less for your golf game. The plants in this slide have a wide range, I think, of things that are beneficial for pollinators and some that are not quite so much and maybe are more for the gardener. And I think that's a great mix, and it's a lovely landscape. But you can see by the little gravel road on the bottom that there's some weeds in it. And so clearly not super concerned about tiny weeds or weeds here and there, or spending a whole bunch of time on weed control or turf control out in the gravel path, just to consider. A lot of homes, maybe more in the cities, are a little bit more, or expected to be a little bit more tidy and a little less wild, and that's okay. If we like take it off in like little bites, then we can like crouch in and take over eventually. But if you look at the house on the left and compare it to the house on the right, and it could be the same house, hypothetically speaking, just around the corner on the other side. If you see something like the front, that's fine and it's tidy and it's very neat looking, but there would still be opportunities to make it pollinator friendly. For instance, if you look at those looks like four shrubs right in the front, it looks like maybe 5. If you were to take those out and replace them with a simple shrub that's a pollinator friendly one, like New Jersey tea or something like that, that would still give you that overall landscape design and components of all of that, and still look tidy, but would still also offer pollinator floral resources. And so I think that there's this misconception that you have to have a 5-acre prairie to make any difference, and that's really not true. Like Jonathan said, species found in urban settings, the diversity could be equal as what they are in rural settings. And my PhD research is on bees found in urban settings. And a lot of times, or at least what I found so far, is that there's some bees that are moving in from more agriculture settings because floral resources aren't there anymore, but they are finding them in town. And so any little bit you do can still help. And then on the right, there's a picture of a slope that should not be mowed because it's too steep and it's just a little spot. And they planted it to prairie plants, and I think that looks really great. And they maintain it, and you can't put in a prairie planting and not maintain, because you're still going to have weed issues, you're still going to have maintenance problems. It's not put in and leave. It's still a garden, and it's still something that you're going to have to look after to really make it look like it does in this picture. When we're talking about what the bees or the pollinators in general like to eat, they can be broken into 3 different groups. Monolectic means that they feed on just one plant species. And that plant species could be a big plant species group, or it could be really narrow and not a very rare plant. And so once that plant species goes away, so do the pollinators, whatever it is that it's a specialist on. Oligolectic means that they feed on a few and usually related taxa, so like anything in the aster family. And the aster family is a very large plant family, so that might give them quite a few options, but they are restricted to feeding off of anything in that family. And then polylectic means that they can feed on many different types of plants. They're generalists, sometimes they'll be called. And even though they are generalists, they could still have preferences. And so they might still prefer something in the bean family. So there might be a whole bunch of asters, but there's just a couple beans. They might go to those beans first, still be able to feed on the asters, but still have a preference. So that's kind of the plant side. And then now I just want to talk quickly about nesting sites and how pollinators are found nesting and what their nesting habitats are. So when we're talking about pollinators, I'm usually meaning native bees. Not always, but that's just usually what I teach about, and so I talk about bees a lot more than anything else. And they are the most important pollinator because they can fly and transfer pollen a lot farther, a lot more efficient. They have different tongue structures. They are just so numerous, and so by sheer number they make good pollinators, different reasons. But when we're talking about nesting sites for bees, about 70% of all of the bee species nest in the ground. And I think that, at least I didn't know that when I first got into bees, and that was like a mind blow. And so that's why bare soil or patches of bare soil is so important to have in your landscape, because those bees will find it, nest there, raise their young, and so on and so forth. About 29%-ish will nest in wood. So that would be like the bee nest, the artificial bee nest that you find. Picture on the right is a huge conglomeration of bee nests. You can either make them, or the bees will find any sort of pithy stem that they can excavate out and make their nest in. Rose canes are a perfect example, raspberries, things like that. And then less than 1% of all bees will live in a large cavity, and those are social bees. And that would be, of course, the honeybee living in a hive. So it's important for anybody that's trying to conserve pollinators to make sure that they do have bare soil for the species that nest in the ground, as well as any sort of twigs or ornamental grasses they'll also nest in, things like that. And so either offer it to them artificially or with your plant material choices that you're making in your landscape naturally. This is just a couple of pictures of bee nests in the ground on the right, top and the bottom, and then a couple of bees nesting in twigs on the left. I saw this happen at Pioneer Park last summer, and it was like they were actively nesting. I was looking at something else. I just happened to like be kneeling and looking at something, and then I saw a little Seratina bee. They're blue, they're shining in blue. And saw it nesting in a flower stem of a penstemon plant. And it was like making its nest, and it had already clearly like laid eggs and stuff, but other Seratina bees were like trying to like take over, because this is like apparently a great spot to have a house at. But the other one that was already there just like stuck her little butt up and just stayed there, and so nobody could get in. It was fascinating. How do not everybody love like bees and bugs? I just don't get it. Okay, so to talk about the Nebraska pollinator habitat specifically, like I said, this is the sign. This is the outdoor sign. This does not come automatically with certification, but the cost of it only covers production costs, so just to be fair. But we're very proud of it, and we really like it and how it turned out, and we've got a lot of good feedback from it. This is the guts of the pollinator habitat. We started last year. There was a backyard farmer segment in April that was kind of like the unveiling, and the application was put online at that time and things like that. Anybody is welcome to become certified. It doesn't have to be private homeowners. Businesses are more than encouraged, schools, school gardens, things like that. We would love to have more schools that are certified. That'd be fantastic. But it's really open to anybody that just wants to conserve pollinators and be recognized for it. That's literally it. So it's not just planting the plants, but that's certainly a part of it. But there's other conservation practices that have to be in place before certification can take place. And then by having that certification, we're hoping that it helps then educate others, like your neighbors that may or may not have contact with us, you know, and sure, I'll tell anybody that wants to listen about pollinators, how great they are, but I can't talk to everybody, obviously, and you guys have relationships with people in your own life, and so once we start the seed, we're hoping that it spreads and grows and everybody gets certified. Can I go to this website?
You have to look up there.
Okay, so this is the website. It should be in your handout. There it is. It's housed under the entomology department right now. And what you'll see, this is really just a landing spot right now. There's 4 of us that are doing this. And it's one part of our job. And so like, we're trying here. Okay. So cut us a little bit of slack, but
you need to change your screen because it's still your PowerPoint.
I need to change my screen because it's still my PowerPoint.
Oh,
it's broken.
Stop share. For any reason.
No. Hold on. We're
there you go.
Technical difficulties. There it is.
Yep.
Yep. Okay.
It's there now.
Okay. I don't know what we did. Okay. So anyhow, so this is the website. And like I was saying, it's really just a landing spot right now. We're hoping to, over time, get more information, especially more information on like the growing habitats or growing requirements of the plants that we're recommending, and things like that. And we want to put different pictures of certified landscapes up as well. So we just talk about, what's pollination, who are they, a little bit. But then more importantly, if you go over here to the left, you'll see the application. And I just want to go through that real quick and answer any questions that you guys might have about that. Okay, so obviously there is your contact information that we just need to know. But then it goes immediately into the garden requirements. And section number 1 is plant diversity. We really just like to give you options, I guess, as far as what you're planting. But diversity is the most important thing as far as what's going to result in a diverse population of pollinators. And so the more plants that you have, the more plant species you have, the more bee species you're going to have, the more butterfly bee species you're going to have. Because you're going to start drawing in the specialists that are only seen on certain plants and not just the generalists that are always found on sunflowers or things like that. So then you scroll down and then you go straight into plant selection. And there's three categories. We called spring, March, April, May, just so we could try to even the months out a little bit. We realized that March is difficult, to say the least, in Nebraska to plan for or to plant for. And so we have a variety of things, and depending on if you're on the eastern side or the western side of the state, there should be things that are included for any of you. The bloom time might be a little different, but that's still okay. And so you have to have, you can have as much as all of them, but you have to have at least 5 plants, and that's not 5 number plants, that's 5 species off of this list. And so we want diversity within the seasons, but we also want diversity within the season. And so we don't want just crocus and then you're done until June. You really need to have floral resources starting now and throughout, the first really killing hard frost in October. And then you go into June and July. And I will say that our group is looking at this list and we're trying to expand it. So it's not quite so limiting because we've had a lot of feedback, and that's been the best part actually about being a new thing, is that people are more inclined to give feedback, and we really like that because it helps us know what's a struggle. And there's been a lot of feedback on how the spring plants are a little harder to find in the nurseries. And so we're trying to look at that right now and edit that to add a little bit more options. But then there's summer, and then of course there is fall. And it's not just for bees, it's for literally any pollinator. And if you have something that you've seen bees visit continuously or something that you always see pollinators feeding at, and it's not on the list, we do recommend that you at least mention it to us in your application. Say, hey, such and such plant's not on the list, but I've really seen a lot of pollinator activity. And so then we can do the research to find out, okay, who are the pollinators on this plant? Is it something that is so important that it should be on our list? Or maybe it's just an exception at that one time. And so that's an option too. So always, please be free to like give feedback, ask questions, make suggestions, things like that.
So Natalia, I know somebody's going to ask this question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you consider annuals as part of that?
Annuals are, thank you for that, Terry. Annuals, we're changing, they're not right now on this application that you're seeing, but we have talked about it for the next version of the application that they will be included. Because right now too, we don't have anything like herbs or vegetables that if you ever want a fruit or anything like a tomato, obviously it has pollinators and has a pollinating importance. So that'll change as well. But right now there are no annuals, but that would be something that I would encourage people to ask about until the application changes to include them. Yeah. Did that answer your question? I'm going to assume so. Okay, thanks. And so then section 3, it's not only just about the pollen and the nectar for the plants or for the pollinators. If you are looking at any sort of butterfly or moth, they're going to have a caterpillar stage or the larval stage where they have chewing mouth parts and they're feeding on actual plant material, leaves, stems, things like that. And so you have to have something as a food source in your landscape for the butterflies and moths at that larval stage. So like dill, milkweeds for monarchs, obviously. Actually, a lot of herbs are really great for butterfly larvae, things like that. A lot of trees are as well. And so anything that you have for either the larvae you'll see on the left and then adults on the right. And sometimes it's the same plant, and that like milkweed nectar is great for adult monarch butterflies, and the larvae will feed on the plant material. So that's not really a hard one to do. Like I said, water is essential for anything that's living, and just kind of to tell us what you have, so we ensure that all things are met or all requirements are met. Shelter, it's not so much for shelter from the wind so much as it is for nesting, overwintering space, things like that. Then there's a section on pesticide use, what you do, we just want to know. And then it goes into section 6, with the conservation practices. And this is something that's literally just for good garden or landscape stewardship, not so much necessarily directly benefits pollinators, maybe indirectly. But like mulching your landscape, it's going to decrease weeds, it's going to keep moisture around the plants longer in the soil, things like that. And so you have to have at least 5 off of this list, and there's 4, 5, 6, 15-ish to choose from. And so chances are that you're already doing these. Or if you have to add 1 or 2, then we give you some ideas on what to pick from. And then this is just information about your garden. We just want to know how big it is, what kind of habitat we're dealing with, if it is urban or if it's rural or if it's somewhere in the middle. But again, anybody can make a difference, and we really encourage if you're interested to become certified. There is a $20 fee that goes back into the program and is only spent on pollinator habitat activities. So just so you know where that money goes. And if I could leave this screen again. I would like to blame the fact that this isn't my computer, but I wouldn't know how to do this on my computer either. Can you see that, Terry?
Yeah, but you're in the presenter mode.
Am I not? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm in the presenter mode.
Not that it's just one last slide.
Sure. So you saw just my big face? Is that what you're saying?
No, it was the split screen one.
Oh, okay. So this is the first activity that we're doing for the certified pollinator habitat people. We're having an open house / class at the Lancaster Extension Office on April 6th from 6 to 8. And there's more information that you can see, and that'll be in your handout, of course. But we're having a program on pollinators. People that have certified their landscapes will be there. And so if you want to maybe talk about, how hard was it? What were the challenges? What do you like about it? You can talk to them at that time. You can talk to the whole team. All 4 of us will be there. I'm going to bring my bee collection of what I caught last year in my field research. It's not all labeled, but we can see the diversity of just the bees that I've caught at just a few places in Lincoln. And then, of course, if there's anything to see out in the pollinator habitat garden that they have on site, we can go out there and look as well. So with that, I will entertain any questions.
So there is one about are flowering shrubs like hydrangea or spirea good for pollinators?
I would say yes and no. Not necessarily the ones that you just mentioned. Spirea is a little bit depending on which spirea it is, but there are some shrubs that are much better than others. Well, and there's perennials that are much better than others too. So like buttonbush would be one example of a shrub that would be maybe a better choice than hydrangea.
Viburnums.
Viburnums are maybe low to mediocre in importance. You'll see some stuff on them, but it's not like they're not covered. How about that?
And is anthractic diamide available to homeowners? Oh, that was that.
Anthractic diamide, there's one formulation that is, it's Scott's Grubex, but other than that, it's a restricted use product.
Then there was one question, Jonathan, about putting fungicides on, like for cedar apple rust.
Okay.
Does that affect pollinators?
Some fungicides do affect insects because some fungicides attack the chitin of a fungus, and so they can also impact in insects. That's still an emerging area of research. There's still a lot more to be done to figure out just what's going on there. So there's a lot of questions, and there seems to be an indication that there's a possible problem there. Mm-hmm. Isn't that what you've heard?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Gary says that we're supposed to go to the Game and Parks website and vote for the state reptile. He wants us to vote for a turtle.
I like turtles.
Maybe he can explain that tomorrow.
We already have a state insect.
Is that the only option, or can we write somebody in?
I don't know. Maybe we can write somebody in. And now we're getting thanks. So I want to thank both of you for staying late. And
thanks for having us.
If there's any more questions, people can email you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Tweet us, carrier pigeon, smoke
carrier
signal.
Pigeon, yeah. I haven't got one of those for a while.
And I think we'll just certify the backyard farmer garden for you.
That would be fantastic.
So I think I can check mark all those plants off for you.
Literally all of them. Yes, I believe you.
So, well, thank you very much, everybody. And don't forget, I'll be sending out the survey here within the next couple days. Please fill it out so we know what we did good, what we did bad, what we can improve, and I'll ask you what new topics you'd like to see in the coming years. And thank you for tuning in for the past 6 weeks with us. Have a good night.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. Ooh.